Hi, everyone. Good afternoon. I think we're going to go ahead and get started. It's about 8 minutes after 2. Thank you so much for joining us this afternoon to mark the opening of Raymond Boisjoly's exhibition with this artist talk. My name is Natalie Bell, and I'm the curator here at the MIT List Visual Arts Center. And I have the pleasure of having organized Raymond's show, which is on view upstairs, The Unexplanatory Void, and which opened to the public yesterday and will be on view until July 24th. We're really honored to have Raymond here from Vancouver, to have produced new work on site, which you'll see upstairs if you have not already, and to discuss his practice in the presentation that follows. Raymond works with text, photography, images, and installation to contemplate modes of transmission and to consider how language, culture, and ideas are mediated, framed, and received. As an artist of Haida and Quebecois descent, whose home has been Vancouver for the last 20 years or so, Raymond expands on the so-called Vancouver School's post-conceptual photographic practices, while also attending to complex negotiations of indigeneity in the context of colonialism. In his work, Raymond often favors vernacular media, such as nylon tarp, commercial vinyl, office paper, or beer cans. I know he'll speak more to that, but by vernacular, I mean non-traditional art materials, things that are quite accessible and legible. And in his processes, he deliberately avoids the conventional use of things like scanners and copiers and inkjet printers, which are often engaged in his work. There's a certain instability and contingency that he fosters in his work, and in what results we can often find visual metaphors for cultural transmission and what Raymond's called the peculiar limits of knowledge production in relation to a dominant culture. What's true of Raymond's work on view here at the List Center is that they deliberately impair legibility and vision in order to foster misperception and miscomprehension. He said, if we distort our vision and if we seek to misunderstand what is being viewed or recorded, then another type of understanding can emerge, and that's a type of understanding that comes through detour or obstacle. I'm paraphrasing all of that a bit, but for me, I think his work really invites us to ponder what is this other type of understanding, and what can we learn from it, and how can we find ourselves meaningfully out of place. So with that, I'll pass it over to Raymond with a warm welcome. Thank you.
Thank you for the introduction, Natalie. It's been really great to be here in Cambridge for the week. Figuring out this exhibition, planning for this talk, it's been a really useful thing in terms of seeing how certain ideas have kind of come to coalesce in terms of the work I made upstairs. So what I'll offer here today is some kind of an overview of some, I guess, impulses in the work I've done, mostly utilizing texts, primarily texts I've written, but in certain cases, texts that I've sort of taken from others. So just as a way into it, I guess something that kind of gives a sense of what Natalie was discussing is kind of an interest in sort of cultural transmission in relation to sort of like text-based work, is this work I made in 2013 called As It Comes. It's a work that came from research I was doing about the literary genre American Indian autobiographies. It's a literary genre that went through a certain historical sort of progression, and in this particular instance, what I was looking at was instances of the genre that concerned historical Indigenous peoples relating their lives to somebody who would then translate and transcribe these experiences and thus edit them and turn them into a literary object that would then circulate. So what I did in this instance was I went through them and took instances of the past tense that appeared throughout. So the books I was looking at were Yellow Wolf, His Own Story as told to Lucius McWhorter, Black Elk Speaks, told to John Neihart, and a book concerning my own great-grandmother during my time, recounted to Martha Blackman. So I found these really fascinating to the extent that I had this felt contradiction in terms of like encountering these works, thinking about my relation to these works. In the case of the book about my great-grandmother, despite my biological connection to this person, I simply felt like a reader sort of in front of her book. Whereas reading the life of Yellow Wolf or reading the life of Black Elk, instead the reader was a redeemed position. I was given access to something that I wouldn't otherwise be able to sort of approach. So I found that to be this really kind of peculiar experience that I was trying to understand. So these texts were really fascinating to me because these modern examples of like American Indian autobiographies really come from this this particular historical era where Indigenous peoples are experiencing tremendous change in their lives. And what I was really fascinated by was that this narration concerning this change, it was thinking about how these books came to circulate, how a book concerning my family could circulate and wind up on the same bookshelf as like Black Elk Speaks, this tremendous work of the 20th century. It's massively popular, just something that was a primary point of reference for a lot of people about like Indigenous spirituality. So it was something that I found really like complicated and fascinating. So I took these instances of these texts from these books and rendered them in this kind of like decayed or kind of was modeling a kind of decrepit sort of look, that there's something that had acted upon them to wear away the text, but they've been displayed in this tiled character. So rather than just being like reproducing it as a bookwork, instead it appears as a strange like exploded bookwork almost. So this is an instance of using vernacular common materials. In this instance, I'm using this particular sort of set of paper from a particular paper company that are all titled after outer space. That's like a planetary purple or something. It's all very kind of very strange in terms of like the marketing around these things, but I was really fascinated by the palette, the given palette that was provided. So what I did was I laid this out. These are all 8x10 sheets. And there's other instances. So I watched closely. These were my first words. I never saw such any other time. It made me feel real bad. She never did anything crazy like that, so this is what they did. So I was really interested in the ambiguity of it. I utilized sentences that really removed any information that would locate it within the particular narrative of one person or another, with the aim that they would instead become like a collective literary work, sort of the lives of these various Indigenous peoples come to read as various chapters of a larger narrative. So in this, I was really exploring this idea about the relation of a text to its physical carrier. Every text requires a physical carrier. No text exists without one. At the most basic level, like text exists as like physically as vibrations in the air, which allows me to like enunciate and communicate with you with my voice. But at another very more like common level, it's like black text on a white page is how we commonly encounter text. So I was really interested in sort of looking at these things and kind of exploring them further and really looking at how I could make work that stressed that relationship or the necessity of a text requiring a physical carrier. So I created these tile printed works that allowed me to work in a very sort of in a way with really limited materials. I first started doing these when I went on a residency to the Banff Center right out of grad school. It's like I didn't have any money to buy art materials. They told me that in the studio I was going to be in, there was going to be a printer with ink. So that was really sort of advantageous. I was like, I guess I'm just going to make work with a printer and ink. At that point, I was like, the tendency within like photography and contemporary art more generally is like, oh, make it big. Like you have to make it big. So with those very limited means, arrived at this process to kind of like create larger works. So I really appreciated the really kind of like makeshift character of it, that I could just throw them together. They could be fairly modular. So there's just kind of, like I just appreciated the casualness of that process. So I was asleep, I awoke again, came to myself. So when these are presented, I don't really acknowledge like where any particular sentence came from. I just simply acknowledge the general source of all of them simultaneously. So it's not like this text came from this book, this text came from another book. To give that sense of the collective process of authoring this experience of this change, that is kind of something that is kind of broadly experienced. So it's not about taking any of them as like exemplary of that somehow they're all articulating their own shared sense of these experiences, because in a lot of it, I just kind of like really think about the peculiarity of like my experience of talking with other like Indigenous people about my experiences, and understanding that there's a lot I don't have to articulate to a lot of my colleagues, to the extent that they'll simply understand as a given what that colonial history has been, how it's impacted our families, our communities, our lives. So in a lot of instances, trying to understand that kind of shared or common ground, that those experiences that are sort of like familiar to us. So with a lot of it, it's about finding those particular kind of like anecdotal sort of histories that allow me to access these sort of opportunities to look at how a work might sort of like integrate itself into another historical trajectory. I was really fascinated by this other sort of thing that happened in the mid-60s to the 70s as a way to combat the production of Indigenous art by non-Indigenous peoples. The process of like serigraph printing or screen printing was taken up by artists on the Northwest Coast, which extends from Southeast Alaska to Northwest Washington State. And it was something that was it was changing the art form. What starts off as very simple, kind of like a feather in the middle of the page, extends to become this very elaborate composition where the image responds to the framing of the page. A lot of Northwest Coast art is often sort of like created at scale. It's kind of awkward when it's when you draw something really small and scale it up. It appears awkward. So they're often meant at scale, made at scale to kind of to give a sense of the necessity of the work existing at that scale. So I was really interested in these historical circumstances that led to the introduction of this particular printing process that coincided with a couple of things. In one instance, it's the like linguistic turn or the linguistic conceit within conceptual art. Was really interested in the strangeness of these things somehow coinciding. but also the N. Scott Momaday's House Made of Dawn that was the first novel by a Native American person to be adapted for the screen. Came out in 1965. He won the Pulitzer Prize for it. And it's a story about a Native American man sort of trying to understand his position between the white world and the Native world. So I was very interested in all of these things. Momaday's book is characteristic of what's called the Native American literary renaissance. So I was really interested in this kind of, this peculiar sort of understanding of all of these things coinciding. Within Canada, there was a tremendous influx of Indigenous artists into art schools at that point. That's where you have the first art school educated Indigenous artists in Canada, is in this period, of which like some of my family were part of that generation. So I was really interested in trying to figure out sort of a way to kind of make work in relation to those, the coincidence of those histories. So I created these works. The title is Interlocutors. They're from 2015. And I was really interested in ideas of technological reproduction in terms of text and image making. So I created the sequence of text kind of articulating what I saw as somehow the premise of the thing I was grasping at. So I'll read them out. They're kind of an awkward size, maybe 15 by 18 inches or something. They're toner-based prints, so they're basically big photocopies. So in person, the black reflects light, while the white just kind of appears very flat, very non-reflective. So again, wanted to use like something characteristic of, in this instance, I made the prints using a machine that's more typically used for like blueprints for architectural purposes, but was very interested in the use of machines of this sort within early conceptual art. So this is the text: a secondary circulation, a primary recirculation, to have found another way to the very same distant places. The past in the present, in the future, becoming something else. The paths between aesthetic and discursive discrepancies. Journeying from there within large negative spaces. Articulation of knowledges of the limit of knowledges. Working through felt correspondences and fictive ties. Lives lived in relation to the movement of celestial bodies. Hours and days of fixed dimensions fading. The beginning always a return of beginnings and returns. So a big interest of mine is trying to figure out how to engage with my own interest in sort of understanding ideas of indigeneity without rendering it visibly accessible for an audience. Like I want it to be something that isn't easily slotted into an accepted or familiar sort of framework for Indigenous art. Colleague Skawanati, who was a Mohawk artist, wrote this text in the 90s called 5 Suggestions for Better Living, where she said, a work of Indigenous art is any artwork made by an Indigenous person, where there might be a certain kind of assumption about certain material processes or certain content in terms of Indigenous art, that in a lot of instances, like Jean Fisher wrote about it in 1989 in the text, The Health of the People is the Highest Law. It's about the assumption that Indigenous artwork is like all beads and feathers, where in a lot of instances, sort of like I feel as though Skawanati provided a lot of sort of license to kind of like understand that regardless of what I'm making, it has some proximity to concerns of indigeneity, despite the fact that outwardly it might not wear it on its face, that somehow those peculiar historical circumstances of colonialism like come to appear within it, that that if it dwells too long on it, that it kind of like can have the character of compromising it and making it feel as though it's only about that particular issue. So often, sort of my interest is in looking at how it can have like a spectral presence, that it can inform the work without necessarily needing to always be about what the work is about. So with this, it was kind of like trying to explore that sort of discursively, looking at how, in a weird way, these experiences or these histories continue to circulate within the work of Indigenous peoples, despite the newness of technologies, despite the newness of like new artistic processes or thinking, that there's still this kind of element of the deep past that can come to circulate within it to like fill it or kind of in a way softly determine sort of what our understanding, our experience of that thing is. So in terms of this, was really thinking about this understanding of really thinking about what our expectations are about concerning indigeneity within the work of contemporary indigenous art. That part of it is about that understanding or willingness to understand any negotiation of indigeneity is itself a like political matter. To even speak about the indigenous character of something is about to like call forth the history of colonialism and the impact of it on Indigenous peoples, families, and communities. So in terms of that, really trying to think of like how these things are sort of present, if not sort of on the face or visibly within the artwork, how to sort of understand them or make use of them. So moving beyond that, it became a matter of finding a model or guide for the thing I was thinking about or trying to work towards. And I found it in a number of places. So I became really fascinated with narratives of people who had deliberately sort of pursued a felt sense of their own displacement or tried to make work about communities other than their own through making themselves legible to those communities in which they wanted to work. So this is really characteristic of that. This is a work I made called Author's Preface that concerned the author's preface that Maya Deren wrote concerning her ethnographic work, The Divine Horsemen or the Living Gods of Haiti. And it's a work that Deren went to Haiti to explore the importance of dance to voodoo and ritual. And there's this really fascinating sort of like realization, which is articulated in the preface, where Deren realizes she can't do that in a reasonable manner without actually sort of becoming an initiate of the spiritual realm she was trying to explore. That any attempt to do so from the outside would fail miserably. So she understood that she had to change herself in order to make a statement or comment about this cultural realm she was looking at. So I was really fascinated by this, seeing it as kind of an indication of like what something like Scott Richard Lyons, who is like an American studies scholar, says that indigeneity is not who we are, it's what we do. So really thinking about those ways in which people have very deliberately like made ties with other communities, have worked within their own communities to affirm their connection to people as being of primary importance, that we don't necessarily get to sort of coast on who it is we have said we have been, that it's important for us to manifest that connection in the present continuously. So I was really interested sort of in this in the language used in the book version of Darren's work, and looked at it and kind of felt that there was this funny, weird sort of like backstage drama talking about sort of how the project was funded, these peculiar details that to me made it almost feel as though it was like reporting for a grant or something. Became very interested in the administrative character of it. In Canada, there's a tremendous amount of like support for like art through provincial and federal bodies that fund artworks. So what I'm really interested in is kind of the importance of that, but then the difficulty of it, which is often when you go and see an artist talk, it can feel as though an artist is reading out a grant proposal or something. They're explaining it in a way to kind of convince you of the viability of it. So I was really interested in kind of thinking about these ideas of administrative language, bureaucracy, and paperwork as constituting their own like literary genre. So I created these like somewhat cryptic statements sort of in relation to that, where I kind of utilize these aspirational sort of things, like accounting for cares and concerns, like trying to demonstrate that that this is the what often feels to be the case is that grant narratives can often make it feel as though it's like that the artwork is itself sort of unnecessary after the fact. You've already explained what it is. You've explained what it does. So I was like really trying to look at and explore that realm and kind of really trying to think through my own sort of relationship to granting. Having sort of like pursued grants through BC, the province where I reside, in Canada, that it's often this this peculiar thing that kind of feel like it's important but has certain sort of problems or difficulties. So in terms of that, I was looking at or exploring how it is that these administrative realms come to impact the character of the work that gets to be made. And in that instance was trying to find some visual kind of a way to manifest that or index that, even in a speculative manner, even if mostly kind of like negotiating it in a fictive realm. So what these images are they're scans that I made of Maya Daren's film, found them on YouTube, played them on an iPad, and scanned them as the film was playing, so that there's this fugitive character to it, where it's like kind of like further questions that sort of that demand for like representation or authenticity, that it intervenes and creates this other layer of mediation, where it's like you're taken even further from the source material of the film itself. So the ones I chose in this instance are the ones that appear most abstract and distorted. In person, this is the one here that maybe is the one that feels the one that it most easily communicates sort of like that there is kind of like a subject matter involved, that it's not just kind of a free visual distortion. So these are all sort of laid out in Photoshop, and they've been sort of overprinted with pastel colors, again from a ready-made palette from an office supply store. But how these were made, it became an instance of wanting to utilize the existing kind of like experience and knowledge of the institutions I was working with. So in this instance, I made this for an institution, Triangle Marseille in France. And I was really interested in sort of just sending them a work via email, trying to not predetermine how it would exist, and just seeing what came out on the other side. If they're like, oh, we know what this is, we know what to do with it. So they had this kind of existing relationship with this, this sort of service supplier. So these are basically just like Blueback Prints that are applied with wallpaper paste to the wall, which in those circumstances, that's just how they applied didactic labels to walls, is through these printed works. So it was just this really fascinating thing to me that provided this this material possibility that I wouldn't necessarily have known to be like, I want this, that's what I want to do. So a lot of it was relying on the experience and knowledge of the institution I was working with. So these are the first instance of the inkjet on vinyl works that are upstairs as well. In a lot of instances, I've become very concerned with like experiences of interfaces in regards to making texts. So very awkwardly, the text that I make, I don't write before I get into an image editing program. So often I'll just edit them in Photoshop itself, which isn't really made for like editing text in this way, not like a word processor. But I became very interested in like visually how it functioned. Specifically within Photoshop, when you highlight a text, if the text is overlaid on an image, it inverts it. So part of it was about taking this very particular aspect of the interface of text within Photoshop and concretizing it, trying to hold on to it, because as soon as I click in Photoshop, that entire inversion is gone. So I was really interested in sort of trying to figure out a way to utilize it or to understand sort of how it might be sort of made a bit more permanent. So questions determining misunderstandings of another, that is something else and truly discrepant, out of place in whichever place it might ever be. So I'll often have this idea for a text, and often to have it visually coherent or feel as though it occupies the space in which I've sort of determined the work will be at, I often have to sort of introduce these words that kind of are not really how people would think and not really how people would speak. So it allows me to kind of like embellish these things to both make them more sort of cryptic, but also just to kind of visually fill up that space. So really just thinking about that strangeness of kind of ways in which a certain term might be just added to kind of like just fill out that center justified text. So in this, also wanted to do these things that would make it appear as if I didn't really know what I was doing. So the text is just slightly tilted. In a lot of instances, it's that weird thing of kind of working in a place and sort of seeing a work, standing in front of it, and just feeling as though it's kind of like a little off. In older exhibition spaces, you'll see it more often, where the floors have really changed over years. But in this instance, the same thing is happening, except when these are hung, they're hung sort of to make the text level, as opposed to make the printed vinyl sort of level. So it takes that that spatial distortion, and it treats it differently. Instead, it's determined by the image as opposed to the object. So really interested in these ways in which the work itself can stress these relationships differently. So to not speak of strangeness, so it may simply speak itself. Evidence of the current time is a continued and continuing strategy of distance. So with a lot of these, they're very deliberately oblique and convoluted. So really interested in what it means to like resist, for it to like be a little bit sort of like inaccessible, or to feel kind of like deliberately sort of like a misdirection of some sort, using terms that in themselves are understandable, but in certain configurations that maybe don't make obvious sense. So very interested in that deliberate pursuit of incoherence in terms of thinking of like what it means in terms of, in a lot of work concerning sort of like identity or positionality, it's about that impulse to like really explain it, but in a lot of instances it's about figuring out ways to resist that, to deliberately pursue incoherence, to be somehow like somewhat impenetrable or difficult. So this is the last one I'll sort of discuss, and it kind of takes a lot of those same sort of ideas, but in a way that sort of deliberately explodes it even further. So tile printed, but there's been little sort of effort to make it visually cohere. I made this in a space that you see almost all of it. It was like maybe a 40-foot wall, maybe 15-foot wide, with a single entrance. So the work could really only be seen from one vantage point. And the work, again, similarly, has this very artificially decayed digital text that comes to display a single word, discordancy, which is a word that communicates the sort of combination of unlike things held in tension with one another to produce something. So it's about the elements of a thing somehow not really wanting to work together, but they do. So it was very interested in this thing about articulating a certain tension, that the work itself is about a certain tension or friction between things that shouldn't necessarily work, but somehow for a moment we can perceive them as doing something together. So it's a very convoluted thing, but you can kind of see the shape of the Y letter form here. And it was like a very funny thing, like standing there, somebody came in, they're like, how did you determine the shapes of the individual pieces of paper? Thinking it was like an abstract sort of design I had made, where I like revealed that it actually said something, but then also being asked like discordancy, like, did you make up that word? So this peculiar experience of just thinking about imagining this word or a use for the word, and then understanding that it's just so awkward or weird that somehow it kind of really, to me, communicated a lot of like what I feel is kind of like at play in a lot of art, is all of these unlike elements being brought in relation to one another that don't bear any natural relation to one another, that we are always aware of their combination. So thinking of it as kind of like something that is a primary experience of so much of art is about what are the elements that are at play. How is it that they're being brought into relation? How is it that they're alike? How is it that they're different? I feel a lot of it really kind of is trying to figure out a way to think very generally about the experience of art, making art, thinking about it. So I don't necessarily have a way to end it, but I think I will leave it there. But thank you a lot for the opportunity to come here and do this.
So we thought we could do a Q&A in the gallery. So I hope you can join us upstairs and feel welcome to engage with Raymond in the gallery space.